Hello, my name is Dr. Abigail Boucher. I'm a lecturer in English literature at Aston University and a specialist in popular and genre fiction of the long 19th century. I'm here today to talk to you about the 19th century vampire, literature, adaptation, and monster theory. So I think the best place for us to start is broadly with monster theory as a contemporary discipline. And then we're going to get more into Victorian issues surrounding monster theory, in addition to some of the origins of that theoretical field. I'll then give you a brief overview of the Victorian literary history of the vampire figure, itself leading into the production of Dracula. And then I will broaden back out to film adaptations of Dracula and how this contemporary monster theory works within those adaptations. So first, I'd like to begin with Bennett and Royal's chapter entitled Mutant. And while monster theory is a very, very big field in and of itself, this is a pretty good primer to start you with some of the big questions that they're interested in. And the major question of monster theory is, what does it mean to be human? Because we always define monstrosity against humanity. And building off of that, some of the big questions within this field then are, what characteristics do humans have or have to have? How many characteristics do you have to lose before you're not human anymore? And what even is the opposite of human? And we end, of course, with the idea that the opposite of a human is a monster. So Bennett and Royal write, literature is, above all, about the human, about what it means to be human, and therefore about the non-human, about what it might mean not to be human. Literature allows us to think about the limits of the human, even to unthink our often unthinking attachment to notions of the human and humanity. So monster theory is tied up, unsurprisingly, with a lot of other discourses as well. So it overlaps very neatly with gender and sexuality, with issues of technology, with nationality, race, and disability. And it's these last two, race and disability, which are most frequently tied to monster theory, as we made apparent. As a quick overview, there are a few categories into which non-human or quote unquote monstrous characters can fall. And these categories aren't necessarily implicitly negative in and of themselves, but they should always be treated with caution, because to define anyone as in any way monstrous automatically implies, whether they're human or not and what those characteristics are. And that comes down to who gets to decide these characteristics of humanity. This is always sort of slightly dangerous ground to tread, which is why monster theory is so important. Now, the first of these broad categories is the superhuman, and this is also known as the metahuman or the mutant. And this is, as it says here, a character who possesses abilities that either don't exist in humans, such as flight or teleportation or X-ray vision or things like that, or it possesses abilities that far, far exceed the top range of general human abilities. So super strength, super sight, super speed, all of these things. And here humanity, or monstrosity as it's sort of a correlating point, is determined by ability, with those who sort of go above that range or outside that range of ability being considered in some way non-human. Another category, and by far the most fraught, is the subhuman, which is derived from the infamous term Untermensch, which was used in eugenics and Nazi discourse to describe typically non-Aryan or somehow otherwise, quote, inferior people. And this is where we see issues of race and nationality and disability really come into the monster theory realm. So we'll get more to the more on this when we talk about Victorian ideas of degeneration. But in this case, humanity is determined, or monstrosity is determined by several factors, some of which are race, ethnicity, disability, and health. But obviously, this can go sort of far beyond that as well. There's a lot at play here, a lot that could potentially label somebody the subhuman. There's also a category called transhumanism, and this deals with the scientific nanobiotechnological enhancements of humans, or a being that resembles a human but is somehow artificially made or scientifically enhanced. So this, this is pretty easily applicable to a lot of sci-fi here, anything with cyborgs or artificial intelligence, or, any sort of film where scientists, mutate your genes or put a chip in your brain and somehow that is able to increase your intelligence or your physical capabilities. Now we can see here, this can obviously overlap with our first category with the superhuman, especially in that it also deals with ability. But this is treated more, generally speaking, as expanding the sort of current range or the general range of humanity and human ability, and then theoretically improving it in some way. And it also deals a lot with issues of ethics in the scientific community and what we should do and where humanity stops after science intervenes. So it is slightly different than the sort of superhuman trope in that sort of way. There's also something called the post-human, and this focuses on humanity no longer needing or somehow being able to transcend its material form. So here, this really roots humanity in the soul or the mind or the spirit, whatever you want to call it. But the important thing is that the body becomes irrelevant here. So in the transhuman, you can slip in and out of other identities and perspectives. This takes into consideration that the material human form is biased and imperfect and suspicious and full of malice. The body is the thing that sows division and strife within the world. And this also can, have its own problems. Anytime, you locate flaws within the body, that can occasionally lead to eugenicist discourse. So again, this is something to be careful with. But it's sort of very positive in its outlook that if we were sort of all interconnected and our consciousnesses were all sort of fluid, we'd be able to see everything from everyone's perspective. There are a lot of different subcategories of this. Like, as I said, this is just a really basic primer to monster theory. But I find that it's very teachable and very applicable. As you've seen, I've used a lot of quite contemporary examples in these slides. So this is something that students find useful, I think, especially in popular discourse. So this should lead us then to some origins of this in terms of degeneration and the Victorians. And I don't want to posit that the Victorians invented monster theory by any stretch of the imagination, but there were, especially in the fin de siècle, some very important things that were happening that have ossified perceptions of the monster and how we continue to represent the monster through the 20th century and up to today. So one of the big issues with the Victorians was that it was a time of sort of unprecedented progress, which is great, but that also brings about equivalent anxieties. And there were a lot of factors that led into this, but one of the big ones that overlaps very neatly with monster theory, because it was sort of appropriated by eugenicists, is Darwin's ideas of natural selection, sexual selection, and survival of the fittest. Now, I don't have time to get all into Darwin's theories of evolution. That is a topic for another day. But we can see how, as you start to figure out the relationship between humanity and the rest of the natural world, and we can see evolution stemming far back from maybe what some people would consider inferior life forms, this led to a real anxiety about what are we going to find out about ourselves? What does this say about humanity if these boundaries start to blur? So the Victorians loved to classify things, and this really stressed them out, to be honest, in terms of how do we classify things when there are now gradations we did not realize were there. This whole messy terrain at the end of the century is where Dracula pops up in 1897. And this is by no means the first bit of vampire fiction, but it is certainly the most popular, possibly up until Twilight, even then probably beyond that. And this is because the vampire as a monstrous figure lives in a very liminal space. It lives within these blurred boundaries, within these sort of different margins and overlaps of society. So we have real questions about the ethnic origins or the national origins of the vampire. It's not a figure that is necessarily intrinsic to Britain, which then leads to all sorts of issues, especially as we'll see with Dracula, and it's a semi-invasion narrative. it leads to boundaries dealing with time. So it's an antiquated figure still living in the present day. So is it a historical figure or a contemporary one? There are a lot of issues of sexuality, issues of embodiment. It's a creature that is both dead and living. It is literally undead. There are a lot of class issues. All of this plays into the stage that has been set by, you know, the second half, the entire second half of the 19th century. Dracula is probably the most retold monster myth in the West, maybe even more so than something like Frankenstein, because Dracula is so adaptable. It keeps being remade in a way that Frankenstein almost does, but doesn't quite reach there. And that's actually a little odd when we think about it, because while the figure of the vampire exists in almost every culture throughout all of history, vampire literature and the vampire myth wasn't that big in Britain before Dracula. I mean, people certainly had a concept of the vampire, but you just didn't get that many books about it. So it was more interested, certainly in the ghost story, certainly in texts about witches, to some extent, texts about werewolves, although werewolves were also, much like the vampire, seen as a little bit of a European and especially Eastern European myth. So the history of English language vampire fiction is actually pretty short. And I've given you a handful of vampire texts here. There are more, not a ton more, but there are more. But the biggest one, or maybe the first large one, I should say, was John Polidori's The Vampire. You have Reimer and Prest's Varney the Vampire, which was part of that penny dreadful fiction, so that really catered to a working class audience. A new installment came out every week for a penny. This book is terrible. This book is about 1,000 pages long. It was very popular, which is why they don't actually know who wrote it. It was either Reimer or Prest. They both claimed to write it, but it was published anonymously, and they both tried to cash in on it later. And then you have Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is a very, very overtly lesbian vampire romance. And Bram Stoker actually stole an awful lot from this book. This reads as a first draft almost of Dracula. Dracula was, obviously, it was a very popular book, but it wasn't even the most popular book written that year. So there was another monster novel called The Beetle by Richard Marsh, and that was far and away much more popular than Dracula was. But we don't really remember the Beetle at all today outside of Victorianist circles. And why is that? I mean, the Beetle is about this sort of ancient Egyptian figure who comes to London and can transform into this, you know, evil beetle. But this one almost never adapted. And Dracula, it seems like we get a new adaptation every year or two, right? They're both sort of equal levels of a sort of literary merit. They're both all right. But part of the reason that Dracula is remembered and the Beetle isn't is because Dracula is a far more open metaphor, a much more flexible metaphor than the monster in the Beetle. And that's really the biggest element of Gothic literature that you need. You need something that is loose enough to be adapted to serve whatever anxieties of whatever period. That's the root of a good monster figure. So Dracula actually he has a lot of stuff layered on him in a way that the Beetle doesn't. And because of that ambiguity, every generation can rework it to suit their needs and their fears. So this is part of the reason why Nosferatu, which was the first major, really famous adaptation of Dracula, I think there might have been a film short before this, but Nosferatu was treated as a metaphor for contagion. It's filmed in the immediate wake of the Spanish flu, which killed millions. So we can see here that a reading that isn't necessarily that present in Dracula, the book, really works here because you have enough of a hint of contagion or enough discussion about contagion within Dracula, even though that's not necessarily the focus, where here they're like, right, we can highlight that element, and Nosferatu, the Dracula figure, can serve as a locus for that, for contagion. So I'll just run you very briefly through this first adaptation because this got the trend started. And what I found really funny about this is that it was a German studio that produced it, German expressionist filmmaker, who could not get the rights to Dracula from the Stoker estate. So they just stole it. They just thought, right, it's time for some plagiarism. They just stole the plot wholesale. And Bram Stoker's widow sued for copyright violation, and she actually won, and it bankrupted the studio that made Nosferatu. However, even though the court ordered that in addition to paying back Bram Stoker's widow, every single copy of Nosferatu was supposed to be destroyed, there were one or two copies that somehow got overlooked or hidden. I'm not entirely clear how, but they made their way to the States. The film was re-released in America in the late 20s to enormous acclaim. It was a huge hit, and it's considered one of the most influential films that's ever been made. So this leads us into looking at, beyond Nosferatu and this idea of contagion, how the figure of the vampire, especially the figure of Dracula, can be sort of mutable through the ages. So we'll look at the Dracula figure and how you can see hints in the text itself that have led to these readings today. In the 1931 Bela Lugosi version, here we see Dracula appearing as European menace. And again, this is unsurprising given that this is right in between world wars. So, we see him as this figure as continental tensions rise again. And Bela Lugosi plays Dracula as this incredibly foreign but very cultured continental threat. And we see this in the literary text as well, where you have Dracula as this continental menace coming in and invading Britain, right? So this heightens up the invasion narrative of that and the continental element of that. We also have the 1958 Christopher Lee versions, and actually there were several of these, so there's more than one film with Christopher Lee in this role by this studio. And this tones down the contamination element, this tones down the European menace element, because Christopher Lee speaks with an English accent here, and instead this really plays up the 1950s sexual repression, as well as issues of fragile masculinity. So this heightens the focus on his victims being female, and the fact that they are fascinated by him and even desire him as much as they fear him. There are also an awful lot of films released in the 90s and early 2000s which deal with issues of the millennium and issues of time. So you can see then again these anxieties of a particular generation being reinvented again through the vampire. So here we focus on their timelessness and how they have to move through time, and yet are somehow sort of apart from every society that they're in, which is something that Dracula deals with a bit, especially when he talks about class and his people and ideas of folklore and the society that he lives in. So Interview with the Vampire is not a direct adaptation of Dracula, but we can see it being reworked here with a lot of the same concerns. You also got around this same time the version of Dracula with Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, and Keanu Reeves. And this version really sympathizes a lot with Dracula and asks if you were, given a chance to live a normal life again instead of a supernatural life forever, would you do it? So again, we have issues of time and the impending millennium here. And then, of course, this brings us to Dracula 2000 with Gerard Butler, in which Dracula is revealed to be, talking about a vampire who goes back a really long way. Dracula is here revealed to be Judas Iscariot, who's cursed to live an immortal life after he betrays Jesus. Finally, one of the more recent versions we have is Dracula Untold with Luke Evans. And this links Dracula to the real-life Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. And it continues in that recent Hollywood tradition of trying to make movies gritty and, telling the real, unknown historical story, that's prompted the legend. But in all honesty, this has far more to do with contemporary anti-Muslim sentiment and anxiety. This is how we've reimagined this for the 2010s, rather than having much of anything to do with a real Transylvanian prince who fought the Ottomans. So this is a fairly racist film, and it's one that wears its anxieties right on its sleeve in terms of its process of adaptation away from the source material. So I wanted to end on a film from the same year as the last one, What We Do in the Shadows, which has prompted a BBC TV series, which is now in its second season. And what I like here in this one still is that we can see the incarnations of the Dracula or vampire figure through the ages. We have the Vlad Tepes figure here, the Transylvanian prince, all in black. We have the more Brad Pitt style Enlightenment dandy with the gentleman in the blue coat. We have the moody Edward Cullen style vampire, this fellow on the floor. We have the Nosferatu contagion vampire, the gentleman sitting on the couch in the black coat. And you can just see here how adaptable this figure is, that they can even all exist in a single film together, and have wildly different personalities and be their own characters while all still circling this same drain of Dracula. Right, so all of these figures can clearly align with a lot of different types of monster theory. Sometimes they pile all on in the same version. It's fun to sort of go through and figure out, not only with each adaptation or each instance of the vampire, how it tracks with the original source material and what our anxieties are for this period leading to this readaptation, but also how they overlap with monster theory. How is this creature determined in its particular iteration to be a monster or not? So this is just a fun exercise to go through with students and to have them think about their favorite adaptation or the most recent adaptation and try to apply these things to it. And no doubt we will see another version of this in the next couple of years or so. So I think there is time for some questions now.